Hello and welcome to part 2. So our first step is to create the plane for the shadows texture. So just add a plane and leave it at the center of the world. Scale it up as much as you need. You don't need any subdivisions at all, so make sure to delete them. You can name the plane as you like. I will name mine shadow. Make sure to freeze transform its values and delete its history, since you want everything to be clean. So go to modify, freeze transformations, and go to edit, delete by type, history. Now for the texture, the plane comes with the default Lambert material, which is fine. Just go to the attribute editor and look for the material. It should be at the end. Click the checker box in color to assign a file. In filter type, switch it to off. The shadows texture is just a PNG file with a radial gradient with some falloff. You can create it in Photoshop or any other software. Great, the first step is done. Now let's move on to the part that every 2D artist loves, which is rigging it. I'm joking, most 2D artists hate this part. Okay, let's start rigging it. First, go to the rigging tab and click on the create joint tool. Just leave it on the default settings. You'll need to create it at the center of the world, 0, 0, 0, so make sure to hold the X key on your keyboard to snap the joint to the center of the grid. Since I have a root joint already at the center, it might be a bit difficult to create another one. So I'll just create it near and then just put a 0 in the translate. Name the joint whatever you like. I named it shadow_bn. A quick tip for rigging: when binding a skeleton to a mesh, you don't need the extra tip of some joints like the head or fingers to be in bind, since it causes more work to fix later when painting skin weights. So instead, name the joints that are in bind to the character with a clear suffix you can differentiate between. In my case, _bn, and the tip joints I'll name with the suffix _be. That way, I can select them quickly and bind only the necessary joints. It also helps when baking the animation. I have control which joints I want to bake in case I have a complex rig. So after we named our shadow joint, we want to bind it to the plane. Go to the rigging tab, then first select the joint, then select the plane and go to skin, bind skin and choose the option box. In bind to, choose selected joints, since we are only selecting the shadow joint. In bind method, I chose geodesic voxel, but it will work with other methods as well. The other settings I just leave on default. Max influences, choose 1, since we are only affecting the plane. Then click bind skin. Now if you click on the joint and move it, the shadow should follow. Awesome! Now we need it to follow the character when we move our controllers. First, we need the shadows joint to be under our root joint. For the next step, it might be easier to do it from the outliner. So first select the shadow joint, then the root joint, and hit P on your keyboard. Now the shadow joint is a child of the root joint. So now if I move my root joint, you can see the shadow follows. But see what happens when I try to move my global controller. It doesn't follow. So now comes the fun part. I'll start by creating a separate controller for the shadow, so I can tweak the translation or scale it separately if I want. Go to Curves and Surfaces tab and create a controller. You can make it in any shape you want. I'll just make a simple circle for this tutorial. I'll scale it up, then move and rotate it and put it somewhere behind my character. Make sure to freeze the transformation and delete its history since we want to maintain clean values. Now we want its pivot to be in the exact location as our shadow joint, which is 0, 0, 0. So while the controller is selected, press D on your keyboard to enter insert mode to move its pivot. Hold the V key and press middle click to snap it. Then just press D again and your pivot is where it should be. Now you can name your controller if you haven't done so. I'll name it shadow_CTRL. You can also change its color if you want. Just go to the attribute editor and click on Display, Drawing Overrides, then choose RGB and choose whatever color you want. We want to put the controller under our global controller. So select the shadow controller, select the global controller, then hit P to make it its child. When I move my global controller, it follows it. Great! Now that we have our controller, we want to control our shadow with it. Before I show you the right approach, I want to show you common problems that might happen and how to fix them when you don't do it the right way. You can skip ahead to the correct approach if you like. So the logical thing to do now is to grab the controller, then select the shadow joint and go to Constraint, Point Constraint, and go to the option box. Choose Maintain Offset On. Since we don't want our shadow to move up or down, uncheck the Y from the constraint axis. Click Add. Now I'll add a scale constraint so I can control its size with it. So I'll go to Constraint, Scale Constraint. In the option box, I'll leave everything on default. Now if I'll try to move or scale it with my controller, it seems as it works as it should. Wonderful, mission complete. Well, actually, hell no. Look what happens if I try to scale the shadow with the controller and then scale my character using my global controller. I get a double transformation issue. So how are we supposed to overcome this issue? Unfortunately, smashing your keyboard won't work this time. This happens because of my rig hierarchy and constraints. If you didn't encounter any problem, then just leave it and continue watching. But if your rig setup is like mine, in which you have a scale constraint on your joints in order to scale the whole character, then that's what causes the double transform. Basically, I have two scale constraints affecting the joint, one by the global controller and the other from the shadow controller. One very dumb and weird solution that I found is to unparent the shadow joint from the root joint. Then just delete the scale constraint. Select the shadow controller and do the scale constraint again. Parent the shadow again under the root joint. Now if I try to scale first with my shadow controller, then again with the global controller, it works properly. If that's not working for you, then another solution is to delete the scale constraint. Then go to Windows, Node Editor. I'll select both the shadow joint and the shadow controller from the outliner and click on Input and Output Connections to add them. Then select them and press 3 to show all connections. Then just click and plug the scale from the controller into the scale of the joint. This should also work. The only thing that's left is to make it to follow the cog controller. So again, if I try to take the controller and put it under the cog controller, it won't work. Look what happens if I try to do so. I'll make it a child. Well, it does follow if I move the cog controller. But look what happens when I rotate the cog controller. The shadow is moving with it instead of staying in place. Rigging is so fun, isn't it? I can't use normal parenting, so this time we're going to use groups. I can affect the group's translation with a point constraint from my cog controller, which will affect my shadow controller. The cool part about it is that the controller still maintains 0 values and is free, so no double transformation. I'll unparent my shadow controller from my cog controller and put it under my global controller once again. Now I'll group the shadow controller to itself. I'll name it shadow_ctrl_control group. I'll select my cog controller, then select the new group and do a point constraint with Y off. Now let's test it. Awesome, now everything seems to work just fine. Now let's just do a bit of cleanup and lock and hide unnecessary channels for our shadow controller. We don't need the Y channel or the rotate channels, so select them and right click and choose lock and hide. So the shadow's rig is basically complete and we can move on to animate our character.